Thank you for having me. That was a very generous introduction. And I'll come back more often if you introduce me. I also wanted to say, if we just take Ranjani to small villages, young girls will see what an empowered woman looks like. That was a beautiful presentation. And speaking of empowered women, let me introduce again my wife, Linda Mason. Much of what I'm going to talk about tonight we've done together, and in many ways she would be an even more appropriate speaker for you because she's still actively doing this work all over the world. In the last 6 months, she's been to Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza, West Bank, Congo, Niger, and she leaves when I return from a trip I'm about to make for Iran. So she is a person of the world. Another theory is that she just doesn't like to be around me very much. But we do really enjoy each other's company. We've had a number of wonderful adventures over the years, one of which was 1981 when we left our work in Cambodia, flew to Calcutta, and spent a month traversing India. We spent about 2 weeks in Calcutta, about a week in Hyderabad, and a couple of weeks in Mumbai. And we had been living in these refugee camps, so we had intestinal fortitude, literally, not just figuratively. And we ate street food in Calcutta, no problem. We went to Hyderabad, and I went to a place called ICRISAT, the Institute for Crop Research in the Semi-Arid Tropics, where a good friend of mine was working as an agronomist. And he had access to a United Nations grocery store, so he had white bread from the United States and cheddar cheese, and he made me a grilled cheese sandwich, and I spent the entire evening throwing up. So I'm about to return to India. I hope that I still have the intestinal fortitude, and I'm definitely going to avoid grilled cheese sandwiches. So I'll be in Chennai, Mumbai, and New Delhi for about a week in a few days. So I'm excited about my trip, and when I said yes to this speech, it was in part because I'm trying to re-educate myself about India. But as I've learned more about Ekal, I realized that what I have to say to you I think is actually extremely appropriate. Now, you'll be the judge of that, but let me tell you what I would like to share with you. I'm going to share 4 vignettes of different life experiences that I've had, most with Linda, and what lessons I learned from those. And then I'm going to play a little music for you because I can't help myself. Just about 90 seconds, and I'm going to ask you to reflect a little bit on your own life and how you ended up being here. So my first job out of college, as you just heard, was being a math, physics, and chemistry teacher in rural Kenya. I was in the town, just outside the town of Kakamega, and I had one of the best years of my life. It was a great experience. The headmaster I was working for was a brilliant, kind educator himself, and he taught me so much about Kenya. There are many great things about Kenya, but the indigenous food is not one of them. I don't know if you've ever been there, but the staple food is pounded white corn, and it's called ugali, and it absolutely has no taste. Fortunately, in Kisumu, there was a very large Indian community with some of the best Indian food on the planet. So my love of Indian food actually began in Kenya when I would escape ugali for chapatis and paratha, all sorts of other wonderful treats. But my job was teaching in this small school, and here's what I learned from that experience. I was teaching to the British exams because, of course, I don't know how education in India works, but I suspect it's probably based on the English education system as well as Kenya was. And there are many fine things about that system, but it was really designed to create people ready to go to Cambridge and Oxford. And most of the rural Kenyans in my school were not going to get close to Cambridge or Oxford or even the University of Nairobi. They were going to move back to the farms of their parents, or in many cases they wanted to be school teachers or government bureaucrats themselves, jobs that were very hard to get, and usually only the politically connected got those jobs. Or they were aspiring to get into the public schools, which of course ironically were free, often serving the more affluent. they were paying school fees to go to a school that I was teaching at. So we were teaching Shakespeare. We read E.M. Forrester. I was teaching electricity and magnetism to people, not a single one of whom had electricity in their home. So I was doing the best I could, but I realized this system is training students for the wrong purposes. So we started a concrete block making company with 4 of my students. And within about a month, they had enough contracts so that they were earning more money than any teacher at the school. We started, I noticed your comment about high value agriculture. We started a small farm that raised peppers, summer squash, watermelons, all sorts of things that, for whatever reason, they grew beautifully, but no one was raising those because it was a very traditional village. And there was a tourist hotel that would pay us more for a kilogram of summer squash than they would pay for a kilogram of beef. Again, my students were thinking, this stuff grows so easily and you can sell it for that much money. This is a good way to earn a living. So we also started teaching more fiction from the African Writer series. There's so many great novelists who come from Africa. So my conclusion was a really good school thinks about what its purposes are. You want to train the students so if they're the kind of person who might someday study mathematics at Cambridge, they're not held back. But that was 1/10 of a thousandth of a percent. You know, the average student needed something more practical, so that's what we tried to give them. The second vignette I want to share with you is the work that Linda and I did on the Thai-Cambodian border. Now, you remember the Khmer Rouge who ruled Cambodia for 5 years quite brutally. When they were overthrown by the Vietnamese, hundreds of thousands of starving Cambodians came to the border of Thailand. The Vietnamese controlled the country and they didn't really want to permit foreign aid to come through Phnom Penh, so a lot of the aid came across the Thai border, and Linda and I were there. I was working for UNICEF, and my job was to go into these 2 refugee camps and try to make sure that the aid we were giving actually got to the people who needed it. When I got there, a study had shown that 80% of the aid was being intercepted by the guerrilla factions, both the Khmer Rouge and the people they had overthrown, the Khmer Sarai, and they were capturing all the aid, selling it back to black markets in Thailand to buy rocket-propelled grenade launchers and AK-47s. So it was a difficult job to get people who had bought rocket-propelled grenade launchers and AK-47s to give up the control of that aid. And we tried for about 3 months to take control of that system back from them, and they resisted us in every way possible, and we had so many failures. But eventually we discovered some local leadership in the refugee camps who were not affiliated with the guerrilla soldiers, and we had long discussions with them about how we might do this, and we came up with a system of giving everyone a chit the day before a distribution. And so they had to line up and wait for hours usually to get this. So the military might send some of their soldiers to wait in line, but they can only get 1 chit. And then the next day you can come back, and if you had the chit, you could get your aid. So we were not naive. I'm sure the military went around and forced some people to give up their chits, and they had some people in line. But I think we went from about 80% of the aid being intercepted to maybe 15 to 20% of the aid being intercepted. And the thing I learned is that we only had success when we discovered powerful local leaders who understood the culture we were working in. And I give them all the credit. They were the ones who were able to figure out what needed to be done. So the third vignette I wanted to share with you is the work we did in the Sudan. The Sudan, as you know, is the largest country in Africa. It's also the hottest country on earth. It would routinely be over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And when it's that hot, some of you may have experienced this in parts of India, when the wind blows, it doesn't make you cooler. It's like being in a convection oven. You feel like you're literally going to cook. I remember the moment we stepped off the plane arriving in the Khartoum airport, it was just absolutely overwhelming. I thought, I'm from Georgia, but I might want to get back on that plane and give this a second thought. So it's a very hot country, very dry country, very poor country. And in 1985 and 86, it was suffering from the same famine that hit Ethiopia. But it was not as well known as the famine in Ethiopia because the government in Ethiopia was weak and international aid organizations declared that there was a famine. The Sudanese government was in denial and didn't want to admit that it had a famine, which made the circumstances even more difficult. I suspect many of you know Dr. Amartya Sen. Dr. Sen writes that famine is more often caused by lack of headlines than it is by lack of food. When we know there's a famine, we know how to solve it. But when a government is in denial, it makes it difficult. This famine was so bad, normally in a famine the crops fail. But in this famine, not only did the crops fail, all the grasses failed, and most of the people in rural Sudan have all of their life savings in goats, sheep, camels, and sometimes cattle. So the crops didn't grow, there was no food to eat, but the livestock were starving to death. So you had this strange inversion where a kilogram of sorghum or millet was 5 times more expensive than a kilogram of lamb or goat. So life savings had lost all their value, and just staple foods like sorghum and millet were unaffordable. So people were really in dire straits. Malnutrition rates among the vulnerable populations were over 60% when we got there. We were assigned a region of Sudan to work in Kordofan, which is halfway between Khartoum and Darfur, a place called Umrawaba. And our job was to try to get food into these villages so malnourished people, especially young children, could recover, which they will do quickly. If you get food to people who are malnourished, that is one wonderful problem to solve because it's much easier than Ebola or cholera or other maladies. So we had an idea based on some work that Save the Children had done, a great man named Dr. Warren Bergren, and his thesis was, often when you bring food to starving people, you create more problems than you solve. What do? You bring the food to the end of the railroad line or the end of the paved highway and you set up a distribution center, and the first week thousands of people are there. So you think, oh good, we're in the right place, we're serving people who are hungry. Next week there are 10,000 people there. A week or so later there are 100,000 people there, and you realize you've created a refugee camp with no water, no sanitation. If there's empty land there, it's probably for a reason. It probably means you can't farm it, you can't do anything with it. No latrines. Soon there are outbreaks of new diseases because all these people come from rural villages and they're suddenly exposed to one another's illnesses. And then there are also refugee camps are unsettling places where there are bad people who steal and do horrible things. So Dr. Bergren's idea was, let's take the food to the people instead of having the people come to the food. So we decided to set up a distribution point that would operate once a week. So it's like a virtual, like a pop-up distribution point. And everyone would be within 12 kilometers of every population in that whole area, which was the size of the state of Connecticut. And the UN said, that's a terrible idea, it's going to cost too much money, do it the way we've been doing it. And we fought them and resisted, and eventually they gave in, and we ran a fantastic program. We trained over 1,000 young people to go out and weigh and measure children and decide who's malnourished and to distribute the food. And we took the food by land cruiser, which is an expensive way to get it to these places. But we created no refugee settlements, and when the rains came again, people were living on their farms and could plant seeds again and suddenly could have a productive life again. Typically when it started raining again and you have refugees in an urban population, it just makes the sanitation issues worse. No one can farm, and suddenly you've created a squatter settlement that's not productive. So what did we learn from that? I think the number one thing we learned is when you do something like aid or development, try not to create more problems than you solve. And that's hard to do. There are always side effects of what you do. And the second thing we learned, and one of the reasons I thought it was so relevant when I read about Ekal, take the food to the people. Take the education to the people. If you put it in the city, only city people get it. Or only people rich enough to send their kids to the city get it. The people who really have the need, in many cases, are in very isolated places. So since then, we went on to found Bright Horizons, and I know some of you actually had children enrolled there. That's a thrill. I grew up in a town of 10,000 people in North Georgia. Bright Horizons now employs 24,000 people. So we employ 2.5 times as many people as lived in the town I grew up in. We have 800 child care centers, almost all sponsored by corporations or hospitals or universities, one of which is in Bangalore for a US client who had us open a center in New York and London and liked them so much they said, "We want you to go to India." Linda and I have not had a chance to visit that center yet, but someday we will. And then I became the president of Berklee, reconnecting to my original passion, music. Berklee's this amazing place that has produced alumni who've won 253 Grammy Awards, 75 Latin Grammys. Quincy Jones went to Berklee, Branford Marsalis, Gary Burton, Melissa Etheridge, Esperanza Spalding, the man who composed all the Lord of the Rings music, Howard Shore, Alan Silvestri, who composed the Forrest Gump music, Back to the Future music, and a couple of other people you may know. Rajesh Mahanthappa, who's got a brother who lives in Boston, one of the finest jazz musicians in the country, went to Berklee, and a very famous Indian musician, Prasanna, who's a great guitarist. Some of you heard him at Symphony Hall, who now lives in New York and is really bringing a lot of Indian musical concepts into the American jazz lexicon. So I'm very proud of what we've done at Berklee, and you know, it's impossible not to feel like I've had a blessed life. I've gotten to have all these adventures. Honestly, have almost never had to worry about where my next meal was going to come from. And so my last vignette is to reflect back on how that came to be true. And it's because of my father. And this is where it really gets related to what you all do. My father grew up in a very, very small, poor town in South Georgia, Wheeler County. It didn't even have a name, it was just a county. He had 5 siblings. The farm could really only grow sorghum, cotton, corn. They had pigs, chickens, and a mule. They plowed by mule. This was in the Great Depression. And the only school in his town was a one-room schoolhouse. And when he was a junior in high school, the teacher was his older sister, who had gone off to college and moved back to the town. So he spent 12 years in a one-room schoolhouse, did so well on the test that the U.S. Navy gave him when he enlisted that they made him a Seabee, which is the engineering division of the U.S. Navy. So he spent all of World War II building airport runways on small Pacific islands, ending the war in Okinawa. He came back to the U.S., went to Georgia Tech on the GI Bill, became an engineer, and went from a life of really abject poverty to a very successful upper middle class life, designing bridges and airports and highways all over the South in the middle of the interstate highway boom. So he had good timing. He was a very kind and gentle man. Unfortunately, he died a year ago last January. But I think of him often and always. And all these adventures I had would not have been possible had he not lived the life he led. And I don't think he could have led the life he led if he'd grown up in a town that didn't have that one-room schoolhouse. So the more I learned about what you do, the more I thought it's absolutely relevant to my life. And you think of, India and Georgia have something in common. The British didn't think much of either one of us. When you think about the way the British viewed India, could they have imagined what Indians have accomplished in the world? Georgia, of course, was a debtor's colony. They took all the people they had in prison and sent them to Georgia thinking, let's get them far away from here because these are bad people. And lo and behold, a few of us turned out okay. There are a few I'm not so proud of. The vast human potential in these villages is something you're giving an opportunity to be discovered. In some cases, to become the next school teacher or to become the constable. But in some cases, probably to go to university and create some software that lets the next generation of young people learn and grow. So when I think about what you do, it makes me very proud that I'm here. It makes me very proud that I've been able to live the life I have. So what I'd like to ask you to do now is to meditate for a minute. It seems like India has taught the world many things. That seems to be one of them. So I'd like to ask you to reflect for just a moment about what were the catalysts in your own life or your parents' lives, or maybe it was 7 generations ago, that allowed you to be sitting here in a beautiful hotel in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the intellectual center of the planet right now, living the life you're leading. And the soundtrack for that will be this beautiful song that A.R. Rahman wrote. And it's so unbelievably perfect. I apologize in a way. It's so perfect, it's going to break some of your hearts. It's the song Ye Jo Des Hai Tara from this movie Swades. And when I'd listened to the song several times, and I loved the song, but I had no idea what it meant. And I watched a YouTube video with the English translation 3 days ago. And I said, I have to use this song tonight. It's so perfect, I can't believe it. As you may know, it's about this brilliant NASA engineer from India who everywhere he looks, he sees vestiges of his small village and his grandparents and all the people working there. And even though he's leading this life, launching some kind of the space shuttle or something, he can't escape his connection to India. So we're going to play just 90 seconds of this, so let me ask you to reflect on your own life while we listen to this. I told you, it's too perfect. And all these young people are just across the river studying at Berklee right now. Some are from India, some are American-born Indians. One young man is from Singapore or someplace. One's from the United Arab Emirates. So it's very inspiring. And when I learned what the song was about, I started weeping myself, thinking about my own father's experience, and I sometimes see those same images of what my life in Georgia had been like, and here I am in this wonderful but sometimes different and alien place. So I'm going to close my remarks harking back to Rabindranath Tagore, who Linda and I fell in love with when we took our trip through India, so much so that one of the readings at our wedding was a Tagore reading. I was trying to design a wedding that my grandmother would think was a very traditional Episcopal wedding, but I think when we started quoting Rabindranath Tagore, we kind of blew our cover. But we love him, and he said this wonderful thing that I'm going to close with. I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and realized life is duty. I offered my service and realized that duty can be joy. So thank you so much for having me.